A 5-year-old boy is playing by a stream in the small village of Nazareth. It is the Sabbath day. He should not be doing manual work by the law of Moses. But he is shaping wet clay with his small hands into the shape of 12 small birds. A man walking by sees what the boy is doing and reports him to Joseph immediately. Joseph comes running, distressed at the violation of the Sabbath by his young son. He confronts the boy. The boy claps his hands once over the small clay sparrows. The clay sparrows spring suddenly to life. They take off and fly away into the sky. This is the first story we have of the boy Jesus outside of the canonical Gospels. It comes from a text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, written in the 2nd century. A few chapters later in the same text, the boy Jesus is walking through Nazareth. Another child runs by and accidentally collides with his shoulder, knocking him slightly off balance. The boy Jesus turns. He says, "You shall not finish the course you are running." The child falls dead at his feet. The boy Jesus walks on, without further comment. Welcome to one of the strangest, most forgotten, and most influential bodies of Christian literature ever written. It is called the Apocryphal Infancy Gospels, and the Church has spent 15 centuries quietly distancing itself from them. Welcome. My name is Brother Aurelian, and today I want to walk you through these strange, forgotten texts. They are the Infancy Gospels of Jesus, the books that filled the 18 silent years of his childhood. They were read, copied, illustrated, and beloved for over 1,000 years across the entire Christian world. They gave us the names of Mary's parents. They gave us Joseph as a widower with children. They gave us the birth of Jesus in a cave, the midwife Salome, the ox and donkey at the manger. Every source in this video is cited and linked in the description below for you to verify yourself. By the end, you will understand exactly why these forgotten texts still shape Christian devotion today. To understand the Infancy Gospels, we have to start with what the canonical New Testament actually tells us. The 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John give us remarkably little about Jesus' childhood years. Mark and John mention nothing at all about his birth or his youth before adult ministry. Mark begins his narrative with the adult Jesus arriving at the Jordan River to be baptized. John begins with a soaring theological prologue, then jumps directly to adult ministry around John the Baptist. Matthew gives us a birth narrative, the visit of the Magi, and the flight to Egypt of Joseph and Mary. Then a single line in Matthew chapter 2, "He came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth." After that, Matthew skips directly to the adult Jesus appearing for baptism at the Jordan River. Luke is the most generous of the 4 canonical Gospels with childhood detail about Jesus of Nazareth. Luke gives us the Annunciation, the Bethlehem birth, the shepherds, and the presentation at the temple. Luke alone gives us the only canonical childhood scene of Jesus, the finding in the temple. That scene takes place when Jesus is 12 years old, during Passover, in Jerusalem at the temple. And then Luke writes one of the strangest single lines in all of the New Testament canon. "And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature, and in favor with God and with men." That is the entire summary of 18 years of Jesus' life, between ages 12 and 30. 18 years are compressed into a single sentence. No stories, no events, no teachings, nothing further at all. This silence in the canonical record created an enormous gap that early Christians could not bear. They wanted to know everything they possibly could about the boy who was the Son of God. And so, starting in the 2nd century of the Common Era, anonymous Christian writers began filling in the gap. They wrote infancy gospels. narratives that elaborated the childhood of Jesus with stories, miracles, and family detail. These Gospels were not canonical. The Church never accepted them as inspired scripture in any formal way, but they were enormously popular. They were copied, translated, illustrated, and read across the Christian world. They survive today in dozens of ancient manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Arabic, and Ethiopic languages. The two most important and influential of these texts are the focus of this entire video today. They are the Infancy Gospel of Thomas and the Protoevangelium of James, both from the 2nd century. Let us begin with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is the older and stranger of the two texts. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas was probably composed in Greek somewhere around the year 140. That places it within roughly 100 years of Jesus' lifetime, in the early 2nd century of Christianity. Important note: this is not the same text as the famous Coptic Gospel of Thomas found at Nag Hammadi. That Coptic text is a collection of sayings of the adult Jesus discovered in 1945 in Egypt. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, by contrast, is a narrative collection of stories about the boy Jesus. The two texts share a name only because both were attributed to the Apostle Thomas pseudonymously. They are otherwise completely different works of early Christian literature from completely different theological streams. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas contains 19 short chapters describing Jesus' life from age 5 to 12. We have it today in two main Greek recensions, a shorter Greek A and a longer Greek B form. We also have it in Syriac, Latin, Slavonic, Georgian, Arabic, and Ethiopic translation manuscripts surviving today. The earliest surviving manuscript fragments date to the 4th and 5th centuries on papyrus and parchment. Modern critical editions have been produced by scholars like Ronald Hawk and Tony Burke of Brepols Press. Hawk's 1995 edition, The Infancy Gospels of James and Thomas, is the standard English-language reference today. Burke published the definitive scholarly Greek critical edition in 2010 with Brepols Publishers in Belgium. Now let us actually read through what the text says, because the stories themselves are genuinely strange. The text opens with our boy Jesus, already 5 years old, playing by a stream at Nazareth. He gathers small puddles of water and shapes them into pools. He cleans the water with his word. He then takes wet clay from the soft mud and shapes it into 12 small clay sparrows. A Jewish man walks by. He sees the boy shaping clay on the Sabbath, which is forbidden work. The man hurries to find Joseph and reports the boy's violation of the Sabbath law immediately. Joseph comes to confront Jesus. He says, "Why are you doing such things on the Sabbath day?" But the boy Jesus simply claps his hands once over the row of small clay sparrows on the ground. The clay sparrows come to life. They chirp loudly. They spring into the air and fly away. This first miracle establishes the strange theological character of the entire text we are reading right now. The boy Jesus has divine power. He performs miracles, but he does so in a child's way of being. He plays with clay birds. He brings them to life as a child would, with a clap of hands. He shows no particular regard for the Sabbath law that the canonical adult Jesus would later debate. This is the first paradox of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas that scholars consistently note in study. The text describes a divine boy with the powers of God, but the temperament of a young child. That paradox becomes much more troubling in the very next chapter of the surviving narrative text. A boy named Annas, son of a scribe, comes and disperses the small pools Jesus had made by the stream. The boy Jesus turns to him and says, "You shall be dried up like a tree without roots." Immediately, the boy Annas withers. He becomes a dried-up husk. His parents bring his small body home. In chapter 4, another child runs through the village and accidentally collides with the shoulder of Jesus. The boy Jesus says, "You shall not finish the course you are running this day on earth." That child falls down immediately, struck dead by the simple curse of the divine boy of Nazareth. The parents of the dead boy come to Joseph and demand, "Take this boy out of our village." Joseph is at his wits' end. He scolds Jesus. The boy responds by striking Joseph's accusers blind. The accusers fall on the ground and beg for mercy. Joseph pleads with Jesus to restore them again. The boy eventually does so, but the local villagers are now genuinely terrified of him and his powers. It is hard to read these stories without modern discomfort about their genuine theological implications today. A divine child curses playmates to death. A divine child blinds his neighbors who complain about him. This is not the Jesus we know from the canonical Sermon on the Mount or the parables of Luke. But scholars argue these stories tell us something genuinely important about 2nd century Christian imagination of his life. They show us early Christians grappling with what it actually meant for God to become a small child. What does it look like to be omnipotent and 5 years old simultaneously, in real human terms? The Infancy Gospel of Thomas takes that question with deadly literal seriousness, and the results are unsettling. The text continues with miracle after miracle of the boy Jesus throughout his early Nazareth years. In chapter 9, a small boy named Zeno is playing on a flat rooftop with the boy Jesus. Zeno falls off the roof and dies. The other children blame Jesus and run to tell their parents. The parents come running, angry, suspecting murder. The boy Jesus stands beside the dead body of Zeno. Jesus calls out, "Zeno, get up!" The dead boy immediately stands up, alive and uninjured completely. Zeno tells the gathered crowd that Jesus is innocent and that he had fallen accidentally on his own. In chapter 10, a young man chops wood and accidentally splits his foot open severely with the axe. He is bleeding heavily and dying from the wound. The boy Jesus runs to him and touches the foot. The wound closes instantly. The man stands up healed and praises God for the mercy of the boy. In chapter 11, Jesus is sent to fetch water from a stream by his mother Mary alone. He breaks the water jar on his way back, spilling all the water onto the dusty road. But the boy Jesus simply gathers the water in his cloak and carries it home to his mother. In chapter 12, Joseph is sowing seed in the field, and the boy Jesus takes a single grain. He sows it. At harvest time, that single grain produces 100 bushels of pure wheat for sale. In chapter 13, Joseph is making furniture in his small Nazareth carpentry shop with the boy Jesus. A wooden beam is cut too short. Joseph despairs over the ruined project and the wasted material. The boy Jesus simply takes hold of the short beam and stretches it to the correct length needed. 3 chapters of the text describe Jesus' various encounters with the village schoolteachers of Nazareth in detail. The first schoolteacher tries to teach him the Greek alphabet, beginning with the letter alpha and beta. But the boy Jesus interrupts and explains the deeper esoteric meaning of each letter to the bewildered teacher. He explains the cosmic significance hidden in the simple shape of each Greek letter of the alphabet. The teacher cannot understand what the boy is saying. He tries to strike the boy in frustration. The boy curses the teacher, who falls down half dead, until Joseph begs Jesus to restore him again. A second schoolteacher comes. Same scene, same result. The teacher is humiliated, and the boy walks away. A third schoolteacher finally succeeds in impressing the boy Jesus with his genuine humility and learning. The boy submits to him gracefully and learns from him without curses or supernatural intervention this time. The text closes with a canonical scene from Luke chapter 2, Jesus in the temple at age 12. This is the only point at which the Infancy Gospel of Thomas overlaps with the canonical Luke text, and it provides the bridge from the apocryphal childhood to the canonical adult ministry of Jesus.
So what should we make of these strange and sometimes troubling stories of the boy Jesus today? The modern scholarly consensus, as developed by Reidar Osgaard and Tony Burke, is genuinely interesting in itself. Osgaard's book, The Childhood of Jesus, from 2009, argues these stories had a real function. They functioned as moral and theological education for early Christian children, not as historical biography of Jesus. They taught children that miracles came with moral responsibility. They taught that divine power requires self-control. The boy Jesus who curses his playmates is depicted as a child still learning to control divine power. By the end of the narrative, he has matured. He learns. He submits to teachers. He restores victims. This is a coming-of-age narrative for the cosmic divine child, not a simple miracle collection at all. That reading transforms the strange stories from theological scandal into theological pedagogy of the early Christian generations. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas was, in effect, an ancient Christian children's catechism in narrative form. But it was never accepted into the canonical New Testament by any later council of bishops in history. We will return to that question of canonical exclusion in detail toward the end of this video. First, we have to turn to the second great infancy gospel, the Protoevangelium of James of Jerusalem. This text, in many ways, is even more influential than the Infancy Gospel of Thomas itself in history. It has shaped Christian devotion, iconography, liturgy, and doctrine for over 1,800 years of history. The Protoevangelium of James was composed in Greek, somewhere around the year 145. That is, approximately the same period as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, in the mid-2nd century of Christianity. It is pseudonymously attributed to James, the brother of Jesus, who led the early Jerusalem church. But scholars universally agree that James did not write it. The actual author remains entirely unknown today. The text survives in over 130 Greek manuscripts, an extraordinary number for any apocryphal work. The earliest substantial manuscript is Papyrus Bodmer V, dating to the 3rd or 4th century of Christianity. It survives also in Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Slavonic, Arabic, and Ethiopic translation manuscripts today. The standard scholarly Greek edition was prepared by Emile de Stryker in the 1961 Brussels edition. Ronald Hawk's 1995 English Critical Edition remains the most widely cited Anglophone version of the text. Now let me walk you through what the Protoevangelium of James actually contains, story by careful story. The text begins not with Jesus at all, but with a much earlier story about his maternal grandparents. A wealthy, righteous Jewish man named Joachim and his wife Anna are childless after many years of marriage. This is profoundly shameful in their society. Childlessness was treated as divine punishment by the surrounding community. At a temple festival, Joachim is publicly rebuked for his childlessness by the high priest of Israel. He retreats to the wilderness to fast and pray to God for 40 days, seeking divine intervention. His wife Anna, alone at home, is mocked by her own household servant for her unending sterility.
She goes to her garden to weep beneath an olive tree, beseeching God for a child of her own. An angel appears to her and says, "Anna, the Lord has heard your prayer. You shall conceive." The same angel appears to Joachim in the wilderness with the same divine announcement. He returns home immediately. They embrace at the gate of Jerusalem. Anna conceives. She gives birth to a baby girl who is Mary. The names Joachim and Anna are not in the canonical Bible at all.
They come from this text alone. They have become the universal Christian names for Mary's parents in every Catholic and Orthodox tradition since. They are venerated as saints across the Christian world. Their feast day is the 26th of July annually. Their names come entirely and only from the Protoevangelium of James in the 2nd century after Christ. The text continues with Mary's miraculous early childhood and her dedication to the temple at age 3. Joachim and Anna had vowed to dedicate their child to the Lord if God granted them one. At age 3, Mary is brought to the Jerusalem temple by her parents to fulfill that solemn vow. She is received by the high priest, who places her on the 3rd step of the holy altar. Mary dances on the altar with such joy that the entire temple congregation rises and worships in awe. She remains in the temple as a consecrated virgin for the next 9 years of her young life.
She is fed daily by an angel of the Lord who brings food directly from heaven for her. This story of Mary in the temple has been celebrated as a feast day for over 15 centuries. It is called the Presentation of the Theotokos. It is celebrated annually on the 21st of November. It is one of the 12 great feasts of the Eastern Orthodox liturgical calendar throughout the year. It is also celebrated in the Catholic Church, though with less liturgical prominence than the Eastern tradition. The entire feast derives, biblically, from a single chapter of the Protoevangelium of James, Apocryphal text. At age 12, Mary must leave the temple because she is approaching womanhood and ritual impurity laws. The high priest prays for guidance about what to do with the consecrated Virgin Mary, now grown. An angel instructs the priest to gather all the widowers in Israel for a divinely chosen husband. Each widower brings his staff. The priest places them on the altar of the Lord for the night. In the morning, the staff of one widower miraculously sprouts, and a dove emerges from it directly. That widower is named Joseph, an elderly carpenter from Nazareth who is already a grandfather himself. He is the one divinely chosen to be the guardian of the consecrated Virgin Mary by God himself. Joseph protests. He says, "I have children. I am old. I will become a laughingstock in Israel." The priest insists. Joseph accepts the divine commission to guard Mary as her guardian and not husband. This single chapter contains one of the most consequential pieces of theological speculation in church history ever. Joseph, according to the Protoevangelium, was an elderly widower with several adult sons already at marriage. His sons are explicitly named in the text. They include James, Joseph, Simon, and Judah of Nazareth. These are the same names of the brothers of Jesus mentioned in Mark chapter 6 of the canon. The Protoevangelium is, in effect, explaining how Mary could remain a perpetual virgin and Jesus have brothers. The brothers are Joseph's children from his prior marriage, not biological children of Mary at all. This theological reading became the foundation of the Eastern Orthodox doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity entirely. It is also the historical foundation of the Catholic doctrine, though Catholic theology has modified it slightly. Modern Catholic theology argues the brothers were cousins, drawing on St. Jerome's 4th century alternative argument. But the original 2nd century answer comes from the Protoevangelium of James, and it remains influential today. The text now proceeds to the Annunciation, the Visitation, and the journey to Bethlehem for the census. Most of these scenes parallel the canonical accounts in Luke chapter 1 and 2 of the Gospel. But there are several genuinely distinctive details that the Protoevangelium adds to the canonical narrative tradition. First, Mary's pregnancy is initially viewed with suspicion by Joseph, exactly as in Matthew chapter 1. But the Protoevangelium adds a dramatic public trial scene where Mary must drink the bitter water test. This is a Jewish ritual ordeal from the Book of Numbers, used to test suspected unfaithfulness in marriage. Mary drinks the water. She passes the trial completely intact, vindicating her virginity before the entire community. Joseph and Mary then travel to Bethlehem, just as in Luke, but the birth itself is described differently. According to the Protoevangelium, Mary does not give birth in a stable or in a manger structure. She gives birth in a cave just outside of Bethlehem, attended only by Joseph and one midwife. The cave is illuminated by a brilliant supernatural light that surrounds the newborn child entirely from above. The midwife, named Salome in the text, doubts whether Mary remains a virgin after giving birth physically. She attempts a physical examination of Mary to test the claim of virginity after childbirth scientifically. Her hand is immediately burned off as divine punishment for her irreverent doubt about Mary's virginity here. The infant Jesus, lying in the manger, then heals her hand. She becomes a believer of Mary instantly. This strange midwife scene has profoundly influenced both Christian theology and Christian iconography for many centuries forward. The doctrine of Mary's virginity in partu, virginity even during childbirth itself, comes from this chapter. It was affirmed by the Council of Constantinople in 553, declaring 3 states of virginity. Mary was virgin before conception, during birth itself, and after birth, permanently as Theotokos forever. The Protoevangelium is the original source of this triple virginity doctrine in formal Christian theological tradition. The cave setting, rather than a stable or manger structure, also became canonical in Christian iconography afterward. Eastern Orthodox nativity icons consistently depict Mary in a cave with Joseph kneeling outside, not a stable. Western Christian art adopted the stable instead under later Latin influence, but the cave remains in Eastern tradition. The site of the cave is still venerated today at the Church of the Nativity in modern Bethlehem. This church was originally built by Emperor Constantine and his mother Helena in the 4th century itself. They built it specifically over the cave identified in the Protoevangelium of James from the 2nd century. The text concludes with the visit of the Magi, the flight to Egypt, and the slaughter at Bethlehem. These sections parallel Matthew chapter 2, but include some additional details not found in the canonical version. The Magi are described in more detail, and the slaughter scene of the innocents is more graphic. That is the full content of the Protoevangelium of James in summary form for the modern reader. Now let us discuss the genuinely enormous influence this text has had on Christian devotion for many centuries. We have already mentioned the names of Joachim and Anna, the parents of the Virgin Mary, directly. We have mentioned the presentation of the Theotokos feast, celebrated on the 21st of November annually. We have mentioned Joseph as a widower with children, the source of Brothers of Jesus interpretation theologically. We have mentioned the Cave of the Nativity, central to Eastern Orthodox icons across the centuries of tradition. We have mentioned the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity in all 3 stages of conception and birth. But the cultural influence of the Protoevangelium
runs even deeper than these specific theological doctrines themselves.
It shaped the entire Christian conception of the Virgin Mary as a holy figure across centuries forward. Her image as the perpetually virgin Theotokos, the Holy Mother dedicated to the temple from age 3. Her image, as fed by angels, kept pure, miraculously conceived herself by aged Anna and Joachim of Israel. All of these images come from this single 2nd century apocryphal text, not from any canonical gospel passage. They have shaped Marian devotion across the entire Christian world for over 1800 years to this day. Eastern Orthodox Christianity in particular has integrated the Protoevangelium almost entirely into its liturgical tradition forever. Catholic devotion has done the same, though more carefully due to the apocryphal status of the source. Even Protestant Christianity, despite officially rejecting the Protoevangelium, has been shaped by its imagery in profound ways. The popular Christmas cards depicting the cave, the ox, the donkey, the manger, all derive from apocryphal sources. Those details are not in the canonical Matthew or Luke birth narratives at all in any literal form. They come from the Protoevangelium and from its later Latin compilation called the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. Now let me turn to that Latin text, which was the great medieval Western synthesis of all this material. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew was composed in Latin somewhere around the 7th century in Western Christendom itself. It combines material from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Protoevangelium of James, and additional new sources. It claims, falsely, to be a translation of an earlier Hebrew text written by the Apostle Matthew himself. This pseudonymous claim allowed the text to be treated as authoritative by Latin Christian communities for many centuries. It became the main source of childhood Jesus stories in the Latin medieval Christian West entirely throughout. It added new details not found in the earlier Greek apocryphal sources of the Christian tradition before. It explicitly adds the ox and the donkey to the manger at the nativity scene of Bethlehem itself. This image, of the two animals beside the manger, comes from Pseudo-Matthew alone in Christian iconographic tradition. It draws on Isaiah chapter 1, verse 3. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master. It became the universal Christian iconographic image of the Nativity from the medieval period onward in art. Pseudo-Matthew also greatly expanded the flight to Egypt narrative from the brief account in Matthew chapter 2. It describes Jesus, Mary, and Joseph encountering bandits, wild animals, lions, and miracles throughout their long journey. The infant Jesus, by his mere presence, tames lions and provides shade for travelers in desert places below. He performs miracles of healing throughout Egypt during the family's long sojourn in that ancient kingdom there. These stories deeply shaped the Latin Christian imagination of the Holy Family's exile in Pharaonic Egypt forever. They are repeated in Jacobus de Voragine's Golden Legend, the most famous medieval saints collection ever published. They appear in Giotto's frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel at Padua, painted around 1306 in Italy. They appear in Botticelli's paintings, Caravaggio's paintings, and innumerable other works of Western Christian medieval art. The entire visual imagination of the Christian Holy Family draws on apocryphal infancy gospels for source material. That fact alone makes these forgotten texts genuinely worth studying with serious historical and theological attention today. There is one more important infancy gospel that we should briefly address before reaching our final conclusions. That is the Arabic infancy gospel, also known as the Syriac infancy gospel of Christ in tradition. It was composed originally in Syriac in the 6th century. It was translated into Arabic later in time. It elaborates on the Egypt portion of the Holy Family's journey, with new miracles and healing scenes vividly. The infant Jesus heals many lepers and many sick people during the years of exile in Egypt land. He performs miracles at every village his family passes through during the long sojourn in that land. This text has been less influential in the Christian West, but is significant in Eastern Christian tradition still. It is particularly important in Coptic Christianity, which considers parts of it semi-canonical in liturgical use today. The Arabic Infancy Gospel also appears, remarkably, as a referenced source in the Quran of Islam directly. The Quran, chapter 19, the Sura of Mary, repeats the clay bird miracle from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas.
There, in the Islamic scripture, the boy Jesus speaks from the cradle and shapes clay birds with hands. The same story we read at the start of this video appears in Muslim scripture from the 7th century. That single fact tells us how thoroughly these apocryphal stories had penetrated late antique Near Eastern culture entirely. They were not marginal texts. They were everywhere. They shaped Christianity, Islam, and popular religion across the region. So how did these texts come to be excluded from the canonical New Testament by the early church itself? The answer is genuinely complicated and unfolds slowly across centuries of careful counsels and patient theological debate. The Church Fathers were aware of the Infancy Gospels from a very early date in the history of Christianity. Irenaeus of Lyon mentions the Infancy Gospel of Thomas around 180 in his Adversus Heresies. He rejects the stories as heretical, associated with the Marcosian Gnostic sect of his time and place. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, accepts the Protoevangelium of James as genuine pious tradition. He uses it freely in his theological commentaries and treats it as a legitimate source for Marian theology. The two Infancy Gospels had very different fates in the patristic tradition of the early church directly. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas was widely viewed with theological suspicion from the 2nd century onward forward. The Protoevangelium of James was much more accepted, especially in Eastern Christian circles and patristic theology. The decisive moment came in the late 4th century, when the Christian biblical canon was being formalized. Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria wrote his famous 39th Festal Letter in 367 of the Common Era. In this letter, he lists the 27 books that the Catholic Church should treat as fully canonical scripture. The Infancy Gospels are not on his list at all. They are explicitly excluded from the New Testament canon. Athanasius categorizes them as books that are useful for instruction, but not divinely inspired scripture themselves. That categorical distinction would shape the Western Christian view of the apocryphal texts for over 1,000 years. The Council of Carthage in 397 confirmed Athanasius's list as the canonical New Testament officially. The Infancy Gospels were now formally outside the Christian canon, though they remained popular reading in churches. A document called the Decretum Gelasianum, possibly from the late 5th century, explicitly listed them as rejected. It declared them apocryphal and not to be read publicly in any Catholic Christian liturgical celebration whatsoever. But popular Christian readers continued to copy them, illustrate them, and read them across the centuries afterward freely. They were too valuable, too charming, and too theologically useful to actually disappear from Christian devotional life, ever. They simply migrated from canonical scripture to popular devotion, from official liturgy to medieval iconography, permanently, forever.
The Council of Trent in 1546 finally reaffirmed the canonical exclusion in the most explicit way ever. Trent declared the 27 New Testament books as the only inspired Christian scripture, with the Apocrypha excluded. From that point forward, the Infancy Gospels were formally outside the Catholic Bible in all approved editions there. But they continued to live in liturgy, in iconography, in popular Christian devotion across both Eastern and Western traditions. The names of Joachim and Anna remained in every Catholic prayer to the parents of the Virgin Mary today.
The presentation of the Theotokos remained as a feast on the 21st of November in Christian calendars worldwide. The Cave of the Nativity remained as the central image in Eastern Orthodox Christmas icons and Christian devotion. The ox and the donkey remained at the manger in every Western Christian nativity scene ever painted historically. The boy Jesus making sparrows of clay remained as an icon of his childhood power and divine innocence forever. These texts could not be canonized, but they could not be erased either, despite their lack of formal status. They had become too deeply embedded in Christian imagination over the course of 1,500 years of devotion. For modern readers, the Infancy Gospels offer something genuinely valuable about how early Christianity actually worked theologically. They show us that the canon was not the only place where Christians thought about Jesus, historically and theologically. They show us that early Christians had a profound need to fill the silence about Jesus' childhood years. They show us how Marian devotion developed long before the formal medieval doctrines about the Virgin Mary herself. And they show us that the boundary between canonical scripture and popular tradition has always been somewhat porous. What we now call the New Testament emerged through centuries of selection, debate, and gradual scholarly consensus. The Infancy Gospels were valid parts of that conversation, even though they ultimately fell outside the formal canon. For Catholic and Orthodox Christians, they remain part of the broader Christian tradition and continue to shape devotion. For Protestant Christians, they are a fascinating historical window into the diverse second-century Christian imagination of Jesus. For non-Christians, they offer a glimpse of how religious tradition actually develops in the messy real world. They are not the lost truth that the Church suppressed. They are not the secret real Jesus hidden away forever. They are something more interesting than that. The early Christian imagination at work, telling its own stories, filling its own silences with its own theological speculation about the Son of God in childhood form. That, in the end, is what the Infancy Gospels of Jesus actually represent in the historical record itself. If careful source-by-source unpacking like this is what you came here for, please subscribe to the channel. Twice a week, we explore the figures, traditions, and forgotten chapters Christianity has only half remembered, together. Every claim in today's video is sourced in the description below: apocryphal texts, peer-reviewed studies, patristic writings. Check them. Argue with them. That is the only way this kind of careful work stays honest over time. Until then, thank you for watching. And please, keep asking the difficult questions about your own religious tradition.